London 1810 arrived under a pewter sky, the sort that pressed low upon the rooftops and made even the grandest streets feel bent beneath some private sorrow. Carriages hissed along wet stone, their wheels whispering secrets the rain would not keep. Among them moved a solitary figure, a veiled young widow clutching a folded letter as though it were the last proof that she still belonged to the living world. Her name no longer traveled ahead of her with pride, only with the faint, dangerous echo of what she had lost. Each step felt measured, borrowed, as time doubted her. She had answered a discreet advertisement placed by a household that preferred silence over reputation, promising respectable shelter to a woman of modest expectations. The letter in her gloved hand bore a wax seal now softened by rain and worry. Within it lived her final hope of independence, fragile as the paper that held it. Widowhood, for all its black lace and solemn courtesy, had not spared her the arithmetic of hunger or the slow narrowing of doors. Respectability, she had learned, was a currency easily revoked. It vanished with a signature, a coffin lid, a single breath of winter. The house she sought stood at the edge of a newly paved square, its brickwork proud and unyielding, its gates tall enough to make small any creature who waited before them. When she rang, a servant answered with eyes already trained to measure her worth. The word widow passed between them like something unclean. The servant's politeness iced over, then withdrew entirely. The gate closed with a finality that echoed deeper than sound, sealing judgment into place. It was the sound of belonging denied, of shelter refused, of a future folded closed against her. She did not wait for mercy. For a long moment she stood where she had been dismissed, rain threading down her veil and into the quiet spaces of her resolve. Pride urged her to turn away without witness, but necessity guided her feet instead along the adjoining wall, where another iron gate waited in shadow. She sought nothing grand there, only the courtesy of directions, perhaps a kind word to soften the bruise of her exclusion. Fate, however, had been listening with uncommon interest. It arranged its meeting not with cruelty, but with a quieter variation of consequence, one that would change the measure of both. The second estate bore the marks of delayed neglect, not ruin but fatigue, as though its very walls had grown tired of waiting for fortune to return. A single lamp burned within, steady and restrained. When she lifted the knocker, the door was opened not by a servant but by the master himself, a tall man of reserved carriage whose expression softened at the sight of her distress. He asked no improper questions, only whether she required shelter from the rain. His voice carried neither command nor condescension, only a concern that surprised them both in different ways that evening. She gave her name with careful brevity, omitting the title that haunted it, and asked only for directions to the neighboring square. He listened with attention that felt undeserved, then offered that she step inside while the rain fell harder, a courtesy she first declined and then accepted with quiet reluctance. Warmth closed around her like a memory of comfort she had nearly forgotten. In that lamplit threshold the distance between ruin and refuge narrowed to a single hesitant breath. It was there she first sensed the strange symmetry of loss that balanced them on opposite sides of the coin. He introduced himself simply, without flourish, as the keeper of the house and its remaining responsibilities. Only later would she learn the breadth of what he had minimized. For now he appeared merely as a man under weight, not one born to it. He noticed her thin gloves, the careful repair at the seam, the absence of jewelry that might once have spoken for her. In his gaze she found neither pity nor hunger, only a measured regard. The silence between them was not awkward but suspended, as though both listened for the sound of beginning to stir at last. She was offered tea, then a chair near the small fire, and with each modest kindness her rigid composure softened into something like weary gratitude. The storm pressed harder against the windows, as if the night itself conspired to keep her there. At last she spoke of the position she had sought and the manner of her dismissal, keeping her voice steady as she named the reason without adornment. Widow. The word landed between them and waited. He did not recoil, nor did his expression close in practiced retreat. Instead he considered it as one might a truth long delayed. When he spoke again, there was a gentleness that unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. He asked how long she had been alone, whether she had means for the night, and what future she had been promised by the letter now damp in her hands. She answered with caution, accustomed to each word being weighed and sometimes used against her. What she had not expected was that her answers would be received not as liabilities but as facts worthy of care. In that small mercy something loosened its grip around her heart without permission or defense that night. He rose at last and spoke of his aunt, an invalid of delicate temper and declining strength, who required a companion more than a servant's hand. The position would be temporary, modestly paid, without promise beyond the coming weeks. It was an offer made without calculation for rumor, and she recognized that fact at once. To accept would tether her to another household and its eyes. To refuse would send her back into the rain with only her pride for warmth. She weighed the bargain as all widows must, with survival on one side and dignity on the other trembling. In the end it was not comfort that decided her but the absence of judgment in his gaze. She accepted with a voice so quiet it nearly escaped her, and he answered with a nod of equal restraint, as though both understood the precariousness of what had been agreed. Arrangements were made with swift simplicity. A small room would be prepared. The aunt would be told at once. Nothing more was spoken of the future than that the night would pass indoors. In that limitation she felt both safety and the ghost of another dependence she scarcely dared to name. She followed him through corridors dim with inherited quiet, hearing in each footfall the unsettling promise of pause in her long flight. The room given to her was plain, warmed by a coal fire and the faint scent of lavender, as if someone had once tried to make gentleness endure there. Alone at last, she unfolded the rejected letter and held it above the flame until the seal wept and fell. Ash marked the end of one appeal and the beginning of an uncertain reprieve. Beyond her door the house breathed with unfamiliar life, and somewhere it a destiny shifted. She met the aunt the following morning beneath pale winter light. The old woman studied her with eyes sharpened by years and disappointment. Questions came politely yet probed with surgical precision. Age, income, family, grief, endurance were measured in calm succession. The widow answered without embroidery, offering truth as her only credential. At last the aunt nodded once, as though approving a difficult calculation. Employment was granted not with warmth but with wary consent. Thus began the quiet arrangement that tethered survival to observation. The house, long suspended, stirred cautiously around them. That morning altered the arithmetic of her days. He observed the trial from a distance, careful not to interfere. In her movements he saw neither servility nor rebellion, only attentiveness shaped by hardship. She learned the rhythms of the household with deliberate patience. Dust fell, fires were tended, silence was respected rather than feared. The aunt tested her with small refusals and unexpected kindnesses alike. Each was met with steady composure. By evening the Duke found himself listening for her footsteps as one listens for weather. The house began to anticipate her presence without admitting dependence. It waited in subtle shifts of light and sound unseen yet undeniable. The first gift passed between them without ceremony. He left a small volume upon the hall table where she sorted correspondence. Its worn spine bore the imprint of repeated hands. Inside, an inscription named his mother in a careful script that had outlived joy. She hesitated before touching it, aware of the intimacy such an offering implied. When she thanked him later, her voice held the tremor of restraint. He answered only that books were meant to be shared. In that exchange trust moved invisibly into place, quiet yet irrevocable. It altered the balance of every word that followed thereafter. London, however, noticed changes more quickly than the heart dared. A widow beneath a duke's roof became a story before it was a sight. Tradesmen lingered. Servants listened too closely at doors. Polite callers learned her name without meeting her face. Invitations meant for the aunt arrived with careful omission. Each whisper stripped another thread from her borrowed safety. She felt the tightening net while he pretended not to see it. Yet silence between them grew charged with what remained unsaid. Respectability, once lost, returned only as rumor. It hovered like smoke after flame, visible yet untouchable and still suffocating. The aunt observed the city's shifting breath with sharper interest than either suspected. One afternoon she summoned the widow to the winter parlor and spoke of reputation as though discussing whether, inevitable and ruinous in equal measure. The warning was not cruel, only precise. A woman without protection could not borrow scandal twice. The widow listened with respectful stillness, understanding more was being offered than rebuke. That night she considered departure, tracing paths of exile across the ceiling shadows. Fear pressed close, yet hope lingered with surprising resilience. It refused extinction even as caution instructed the will toward retreat again. He confronted the rumors first through absence rather than argument. Invitations ceased to reach him. Old acquaintances passed without salute. Credit that once arrived with polite delay began to stall entirely. The house felt the shift in missing provisions and tightened accounts. Still, when he looked at her, the disorder of the world fell briefly into coherence. He did not speak of danger and she did not ask. Between them grew a mutual conspiracy of protection, unspoken and therefore fragile. They walked the garden paths more quietly now, as though footsteps themselves might betray them. Even the roses seemed watchful. The small ballroom gathering that followed had been arranged as obligation rather than pleasure. The aunt insisted upon it with merciless clarity. Attendance would signal innocence or concede guilt by absence. The widow dressed with controlled simplicity, choosing modest silk over display. When they arrived, conversation thinned like breath in cold air. Faces turned with careful timing. No accusation spoke aloud, yet every smile carried inference. The Duke offered his arm without hesitation and guided her into the room's guarded center. That single gesture cracked the evening's brittle composure and let speculation spill freely. It rushed through every watching eye. They danced only once, a courtesy stripped to its formal skeleton. Music threaded past them with cautious rhythm. His hand was steady, neither claiming nor retreating. Hers rested there with disciplined restraint. Whispers followed the movement of their steps like shadows unwilling to detach. When the final note concluded, the silence that answered was louder than applause. She felt exposed, yet not unguarded. Something in his composure lent her borrowed strength. For the first time since her loss, she was publicly visible without being entirely undone. The night released them only when scrutiny weakened with fatigue. Even then, eyes lingered. The cost of that single dance arrived with brutal economy. A letter waited upon his desk the following morning, its tone stripped of courtesy. Creditors demanded assurance that the disorder of his household would be corrected by suitable alliance. Debts were named with pitiless accuracy. Time, once indulgent, now marched with open threat. He read it in silence, folding the paper with greater care than it deserved. At breakfast he spoke lightly of weather and schedules, yet the shadow in his eyes betrayed a reckoning newly unavoidable. She sensed the shift without understanding its full measure. The air felt weighted. She found the book he had given her waiting upon her pillow that night, open to a page she had not yet read. A pressed leaf lay between the margins, autumn-colored and deliberate. It was no declaration, yet meaning trembled beneath its simplicity. She closed the volume slowly, understanding both the gift and its danger. To accept it was to admit being seen. To return it would be to surrender something unnamed yet already prized. Down the corridor the house slept in wary harmony, unaware of the quiet decisions unfolding in its upper rooms. Choice crept closer with insistence. He stood long at his window before sleep claimed him, London spread beneath in indifferent sprawl. The letter from his creditors rested folded in his pocket like a wound refused air. In the dark he admitted what daylight denied, that the widow's presence had become the measure by which the house now lived. Honor demanded retreat. Something older than lineage urged advance. Between those oppositions his future narrowed into a single trembling question. When morning came, it would demand an answer written not in silence but in consequence. Down the corridor she slept unaware that both shelter and exile waited. Morning arrived with no ceremony, only the pale insistence of winter light pressing through the curtains. The letter lay where he had left it, a quiet weight upon his desk that refused to be displaced by habit. He did not summon her, nor did she seek him. The house moved by instinct alone, each of them circling an unspoken truth with the caution of those who sense peril beneath calm waters. At breakfast the aunt observed them both with deliberate restraint, noting the careful distance, the softened glances that failed to hide their vigilance. Silence, once companionable, now gathered edges. The widow felt the change before she understood its shape. It became present in the servants' glances, in the precision with which tasks were now assigned, in the faint pause before her name was spoken aloud. She had lived long with the instinct for departure, and it stirred again with quiet persistence. Yet she lingered, pulled by something as stubborn as it was irrational. In the afternoons she read from the book he had given her beside the aunt's chair, and the old woman listened with eyes half closed, as though recognizing some echo of the house's lost gentleness. Late one evening, as firelight thinned and shadows lengthened, he found her alone in the library. The book lay open upon her lap, forgotten. Words hovered on his lips before courage assembled them into speech. He did not speak at once. Instead he stood, listening to the clock's slow confession of time passing. When he did speak, it was with unguarded honesty, telling her that the house stood at the brink of financial disgrace, that debts pressed close and reputation bled into every account. He framed his admission as explanation, yet she heard the apology beneath it. She answered not with surprise but with recognition. In a low voice she told him the truth of her own losses, how she had entered marriage for shelter rather than affection, how brief security had been followed by sudden erasure. She spoke without ornament of the way death rearranged affection into liability. Her candor stripped the room of pretension until only necessity and longing remained. Each detail she offered drew the space between them taut with understanding. He listened as one listens to confession, with gravity and unfaltering attention. There was no rescue in his silence, only witness. They spoke long into the night without resolution, yet with something sharpened into place between them. When she rose at last to leave, weariness softened her movements. He followed her halfway to the door before duty reasserted itself. The corridor swallowed her figure and with it his restraint. Alone again, the library felt altered by the absence of her voice, as though silence had been given new measure. He did not sleep that night. The ledger of his obligations lay open but unread. For the first time he considered wealth not as salvation but as rival. The next days unfolded with careful choreography. The aunt's health faltered with inconvenient timing, demanding the widow's near constant presence. Their intimacy sharpened in the quiet intimacy of care. Hands brushed in shared errands. Glances lengthened and unspooled. Yet restraint tightened with equal force. Beneath each exchange trembled the knowledge that choice, once delayed, only grew more exacting. The creditors did not wait politely. A second letter arrived, sterner and more explicit. A union of advantage was named not as suggestion but as condition. The Duke read it without expression and folded it into resolve. She overheard the truth not from him but from the house itself. Servants whispered where corridors narrowed, and in those murmurs she learned of the wealthy young woman proposed as his deliverance. Her name passed like a door closing. The widow received this knowledge with unexpected calm. It did not wound at once, but settled slowly into a colder understanding. That night she returned the book to the library shelf with deliberate care. The leaf fell from between its pages and lay upon the floor unnoticed. Silence became her preparation. She packed with controlled economy before dawn. When he found her room stripped of presents, the space seemed smaller, as though the walls had drawn inward. Panic took him without pretense. The aunt, already awake, observed his disarray with an expression not unkind. In that moment she spoke the only benediction she would ever allow herself. She told him that survival purchased with self-betrayal bred only more ruin. Her voice did not rise, yet its force bent the room toward truth. He did not answer. He was already reaching for his coat. By the time the door closed behind him, heedless of the hour, he had chosen. Her carriage moved steadily through the thin dawn, each hoofbeat measuring the distance she intended to place between herself and hope. She did not permit tears the dignity of a rival. Loss had long since exhausted that language. It was only when the carriage slowed under the press of traffic that the past finally caught her breath. She heard the shout before she saw him, incongruous and living against the gray. He stood before the horses without regard for consequence. When the carriage halted at last, the world seemed to hold its breath in unpaid suspense. He spoke with no careful tempering, all restraint invested now in urgency. He told her that he would not trade her courage for credit, nor silence the life she had restored to his house in exchange for gilded rescue. Words gathered behind his voice with reckless clarity. For the first time he named what had grown between them not as error but as truth. The street, still waking, bore witness in scattered glances and startled pauses. She listened without interruption until his voice failed beneath its own admission. When at last silence reclaimed them, it was complete. Her answer did not arrive as surrender but as question. She asked what shelter his choice would build for either of them, what world he envisioned when the old one turned against them both. It was the inquiry of a woman who had learned the cost of promises made without ground. He answered not with assurance but with resolve. He offered not spectacle but constancy. He did not promise ease, only partnership in the work of survival. In that economy she found the only currency she still trusted. She opened the carriage door and stepped down into uncertainty. They returned to the house together as equals neither yet named. Word of their defiance traveled ahead of them with all the speed of scandal newly born. The aunt received them with unspoken approval and nothing more. No celebration disturbed the gravity of what had been accepted. That evening the house felt different, not safer but true. Windows burned with steady light as darkness gathered its facts. Within those rooms, choice had been bound to consequence without disguise. The world beyond would not soften in response. Yet for the first time, neither would retreat. Night fell with the measured finality of oath. From his window he watched the city settle into blurred constellations of light and shadow. She stood beside him, the distance between them now unburdened by avoidance yet heavy with promise. Neither spoke. Words would come later when proofs replaced declarations. Below them the street resumed its indifferent passage. Debts remained. Judgment waited. Yet within that chamber the future, still unmerciful, had been met without disguise. What followed would demand more than longing. It would require endurance sharpened into shared defiance. The morning of reckoning arrived not with thunder but with a steady procession of consequence. The Duke did not hide his decision behind negotiation or delay. He answered the creditors with a declaration more dangerous than defiance, naming his intention to marry without regard for their approval and to rebuild by labor rather than alliance. The letter bore no flourish, only a clarity that left no refuge for reversal. By noon the city had begun to murmur. By evening the murmurs sharpened into judgment. The widow, now standing openly beside him, felt the tremor of exposure ripple through every corridor of the house. They walked together through the drawing rooms where portraits of unsmiling ancestors watched with inscrutable regard. No veil of secrecy softened her presence now. Servants bowed with uncertain loyalty, measuring each step against the shifting ground of power. The aunt observed all with unspoken vigilance, her frailty sharpened by purpose. No blessing was announced. Yet approval lived in the quiet authority of her silence. That night the widow slept without dreaming of departure for the first time in many years, though the cost of belonging loomed like a horizon she had not yet crossed. Society answered swiftly. Invitations once tentative vanished entirely. The promised heiress withdrew with polite finality. Accounts closed where credit had once lingered with weary indulgence. The Duke met each refusal without public bitterness, yet the weight of it pressed into his posture. He learned the arithmetic of necessity with a new severity, selling what could be spared, dismissing extravagance without ceremony. The widow stood beside him not as ornament but as witness. She kept the accounts with steady precision, her hands unafraid of figures that named sacrifice. In partnership the house found a harder, truer order. The wedding was arranged not as spectacle but as statement. No fanfare softened its defiance. Word traveled nonetheless, and the small chapel filled with those who came not for approval but for proof. The widow walked without veil, her face unhidden by modest courage rather than display. When she reached him, waiting without entourage or pretense, the world beyond the chapel narrowed to the truth they had chosen. The vows were spoken without trembling, as though each word repaired some long-standing fracture in both their lives. Applause followed, slow at first, then steady. Afterward they did not depart for any distant retreat, nor did they perform ease for onlookers. They returned to the house they had chosen to defend and rebuild. The aunt received the new duchess with a brief nod that served as coronation enough. That evening the servants gathered not in celebration but in quiet acknowledgment. The household had survived a crossing. It would not be the last. Yet something in the air had shifted from suspense to endurance. The widow, now wife, felt the weight of her name settle into place without erasing the one she had borne alone. Creditors returned with altered tone when rebuilding proved stubbornly real. The Duke's open refusal to dissolve into disgrace through advantageous marriage unsettled expectations but steadied trust where strength could be measured. Repayment began in careful increments. It would be slow, and none pretended otherwise. Yet the house no longer starved for direction. The widow brought new discipline to its economy, her experiences of scarcity and negotiation rendered into order. What society had dismissed as disadvantage now proved the architecture of survival. Together they traded grandeur for persistence without regret. The city did not soften all at once. Whispers still followed her steps beyond the gates. Some doors remained closed with stubborn discretion. Yet others opened with cautious respect. Not admiration, not yet, but recognition that endurance carried its own authority. Children in the neighborhood learned her name without the hush of scandal. Suppliers tested their trust in measured exchanges that, over time, widened into reliability. The Duke watched these changes with subdued wonder, as though the life he had refused to purchase outright was being earned instead by deliberate hands. It was slower, yet it was theirs. She reclaimed the gardens not as ornament but as promise. New plantings broke the tired soil with patient defiance. Each seed mirrored her own return from erasure. When blossoms appeared where neglected ruled, the servants paused to admire them with understated pride. The Duke observed her among the flowers one afternoon and felt the strange reversal of power that love had authored between them. What society had named weakness had remade his house more thoroughly than wealth ever had. In her steadiness he discovered the shape of a future that did not require surrender. The aunt declined steadily yet without bitterness. Her days shortened with the quiet dignity of work completed. Before winter took her, she left them the house unencumbered by hidden burden, its fate sealed by a choice already honored in life. The loss arrived with expected sorrow and unexpected clarity. In the silence that followed, they felt both the cost of endurance and its reward made manifest. There would be no gentle inheritance beyond the labor already underway. They accepted this without negotiation. Grief, once survived, had taught each the discipline of continuance. Years later, when memory blurred the sharpest edges of rumor into something less cruel, the widow would stand beneath the same iron gate where rejection had once startled her into exile. She stood now not as plea but as presence, greeting visitors with composed authority. Rain still fell upon the square with familiar insistence, yet it no longer pressed her toward flight. The Duke watched from the window as she spoke with a young woman newly arrived, her posture echoing the same restrained desperation she once carried. In offering directions, she offered something more enduring than shelter. That evening they dined without ceremony, the house warm with the converging sounds of work and quiet contentment. Candlelight moved softly across the walls, illuminating no portraits of triumph, only the living faces of those gathered within consequence rather than comfort. The widow met her husband's gaze across the table with restrained warmth, neither ashamed of what had been surrendered nor dazzled by what had been gained. Their story had not delivered them into ease, but it had delivered them into truth. Outside, London continued its indifferent breathing, unaware of the quiet victory forged behind these walls. Later, when the house settled and the streets softened into distance, she returned to the small room where her first night had passed in borrowed safety. The lavender scent had long faded, yet memory lingered in the grain of the floor. She rested her hand against the doorframe with reflective tenderness before leaving it behind at last. Below, her husband waited by the hearth they now shared, its steady flame answering the long labor of becoming. Together they stood within the future they had chosen, knowing it would never be gentle, yet finally knowing it would be theirs.